there, ladies and gentlemen. Jens Davidson here once again. So, I've been called a Renaissance man by many people over the last 12 years or so, because I've really gotten into a lot of varied interests, ranging from blacksmithing and welding and obviously woodworking. Built a cabinet in my basement. That was some of my earlier YouTube videos. Antique restorations like the cast iron skillet that's by far become my most popular content on my channel. Even to restoring a ballpark 100-year-old woodworking plane. And if you haven't seen any of these videos, please take some time and watch my other content. But today we're going into a whole different ball game. So yeah, the same guy here that has worked with super aggressive power tools, a 4.5-inch angle grinder on a 1950s cast iron skillet. That same guy is going to be baking bread. Yep. I've baked bread many times. Started doing it when I was in graduate school for chemistry back in 2015, I believe, or 14. And it turned out pretty well. I've had some pretty lousy loaves of bread, but that's par for the course. Today, we're going to do an experiment wherein we will hybridize my two favorite types of bread. The first type is no-knead bread, so that's bread that you don't knead, not that N-E-E-D. Unless you're gluten intolerant, you need bread. Bread's great. Sorry, GF folks. My sister's GF. Whole different subject. No-knead bread. It's bread that you do not work. You do not put your hands into stretching and kneading and working the dough in order to form the gluten. No-knead bread is a very high hydration dough, and as such, having high hydration, the yeast has a very easy job of moving around, migrating throughout the dough and fermenting during that initial bulk fermentation stage. And to sort of facilitate this, if you're kneading dough, generally you're in the hydration range of 70% or less. Your kneading process will, obviously it depends on your strength and whatnot, but ballpark 20 minutes of kneading and you're ready to let it go through the bulk fermentation of just 2 or 3 hours or so, and then your secondary rise. With no-knead bread, your bulk fermentation stage is not 4 hours, it's about 12 to 18 hours. So it's a considerably longer period of time, but that's time that you're not doing anything. You literally just mix flour, water, yeast, salt in a big bowl, stir it very minimally, cover it in plastic and leave it on the countertop until the next day, so you can start your loaf of bread in one evening and bake it the following day. I'm hybridizing this type of bread, and I encourage you to look it up on New York Times. It's one of their most popular styles of bread or recipes in New York Times cooking that they've ever done. It was popularized by Jim Leahy of Sullivan Street Bakery. And yeah, I've made some absolutely astonishing loaves of bread doing that. And that was my very first loaves of bread, so you do not need to have much experience. Anyway, I'm going to be hybridizing that with sourdough bread, which I began enjoying back in, well, I started my sourdough starter on New Year's Day of 2019, so I've been baking sourdough bread for a couple of years now, and I still have the same starter in my refrigerator. I've been feeding it, maintaining it, so on and so forth. Probably not going to cover feeding and maintaining it in this video, maybe I will. But anyway, we'll get to that later. So I want to hybridize these two types of bread to make a no-knead sourdough bread. There's the saying that there's nothing new under the sun, that any idea you come up with, somebody's probably already come up with the same idea. For my part, I have not researched this at all. Obviously I can research it because I have a smartphone and the internet, but I'm not going to do that. I came up with this idea myself. I was not influenced by any outside sources, anybody else, any people, any vlogs or blogs online or anything like that. I just came up with the idea one day and figured I should try that. So yes, somebody else has probably done a no-knead sourdough bread. People have been baking bread for thousands of years, so it's probably already been done. But I did calculations yesterday on how to attain the proper hydration for a no-knead bread using sourdough starter and going for a target of a 500 gram loaf of bread or thereabouts. So the New York Times no-knead bread recipe, that calls for 80% hydration, and so I'm going to take my sourdough starter, which is 100% hydration, and I'm going to, I think the formula I came up with, or the recipe I came up with, formula, I'm a chemist, is going to be 400 grams of flour, 300 grams of water, 200 grams of sourdough starter, and 10 grams of salt. And I'll mix this up in a bowl, cover it with plastic wrap, and we'll get back to it tomorrow evening when I prep it to bake. So let's talk real quick about hydration, dough hydration. For those of you who don't know what that is, or maybe you've heard of it and your research on the subject has only left you with confusion, hopefully I can clarify it a bit here. Hydration is all about water content, and there's two ways to look at the water content of a bit of dough that you're going to be baking once you've added all the ingredients. When you have, let's just hypothetically say, you take a bowl, you put 100 grams of flour in there and 100 grams of water in there. That will be a relative hydration or relative water content of 100% because you have equal parts of flour and water. The absolute concentration of water will be 50% because you have 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, that's 200 grams total, and out of that 200 grams, 50% is water. That's not the way that you look at hydration. Hydration is how much water relative to the flour. So it's relative water content. So 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, 100% of your flour is also added in water. So you have a 100% hydration. In the realm of baking, generally 80% is considered very high hydration. It's challenging to work with, but you get really nice rise and you get nice crust, fairly thin crust, not something that you need a saw to rip through. Sourdough bread, some of the starter recipes for sourdough for beginner bakers is around about 65-66% hydration. And so basically you take how many grams of flour is going to be in the total finished product, or the bowl before you bake it, let's say, and how much water is going to be in there. So if you've got, again, let's do another example. Let's say you got 500 grams of flour that's going into your recipe, and the recipe calls for, let's say, 250 grams of water. That's 50% hydration, because you take the amount of flour, multiply that by 50%, and that's how much water you're going to be adding into the bowl. So with the hydration calculation for sourdough bread, most sourdough starter recipes, so starter is the yeast that you're adding to the bread. You're not adding that, the dried little pellets that you get in the Red Star packet. You're not adding that, you're using a yeast culture. Most recipes for that, again, for beginner bakers, are tailored to 100% hydration. In the jar of starter that you've got, you have equal parts of flour and water, and so it is 100% hydration. So when you go to calculate your hydration of a sourdough bread loaf or recipe, in my example, 400 grams of flour, 300 grams of water, 200 grams of starter. So let's look at the flour content here. I got 400 grams of flour and I got 200 grams of starter. That 100% hydration starter is going to be 100 grams of flour. So 400 plus 100 is obviously 500 grams of flour total in the batch. Added to that, I've got 300 grams of water that I'm going to be adding, and 100 grams of water from the sourdough starter. So it's going to be 500 grams of total flour in the bowl, and 400 grams of total water in the bowl. Again, there is flour contributed to this recipe from the starter, and there is water contributed to this recipe from the starter. When we do the math, 500 and 400, that's 80%. Take 500, multiply it by 0.8 or 80%, and you get 400 grams of total water. So I hope that has clarified the concept of dough hydration for you. I've read some articles on it when I was getting started in baking, and yeah, there was some ambiguity to it. Some people didn't explain it that well, but hopefully I've explained it well enough to you guys. Not a super challenging concept, but again, if somebody doesn't do a good job of explaining anything, you're going to have a hard time figuring it out. So without further ado, I'm going to stop jabbering, and we're going to go ahead and get a bowl and some flour and some water and my starter and get cracking on setting up this bread.